That's what's on the minds of people who have come out of the public school system or who are starting to homeschool from day one. I see a lot of young moms, that always makes me kind of chuckle, where their children are like 3 and 4 or like, 5 and 2. And they're like, I'm really concerned. What curriculum shall I get? And they have this whole long list of things that they want to teach their kids that they think should be taught because that's what the public schools teach. And they ask for advice on what curriculum is the best. What should I get? What should I get? What should I get? And frankly, that's the wrong question to ask at the beginning, especially as we're preparing for this new school year. When you're homeschooling, our school years look a little bit different. A lot of homeschooling families school throughout the year. And there's also those who like take a break during the summer, which both ways are fine. You know why? Because it's homeschool and we get to pick. But again, going back to that curriculum question, that's the wrong question to start off with. And so today I really want to focus on really creating a vision for your family, talk about their passions, talk about learning styles, and then talk about how long you need to spend with the children during that learning period. What does that look like? What does attention spans really look like? Which I feel like our schools are grossly failing in when it comes to understanding children's attention spans. So I'm very excited to get started today. So the first question you really need to ask as we start homeschooling is, what do you want your life and your family to look like? In the business world, Stephen Covey, who wrote the books 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, one of his big habits is you begin with the end in mind, right? They use it in business all the time with businesses, but how often do we think about that as a family? What's the end goal? I love in Alice in Wonderland, Alice asks the question of the Cheshire Cat from Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland. Would you tell me, please, which way I ought to go from here? And the Cheshire Cat answers, well, that depends a good deal on where you want to get to. And Alice says, I don't much care where. And the Cheshire Cat answers back, well, then it really doesn't matter which way you go. Unfortunately, I think for a lot of us, we just kind of let life and our family happen as opposed to really thinking about what is our end goal for our family? Like, what's our vision for our family? I started coaching with an unschooling mom several months ago. Her name is Nicole Schiffler, and she's become a good friend to me as well as a coach. And that was the very first thing that we discussed was like, what is the vision that you have for your family? And I had been thinking about it, right? Most people think about it for companies and for business, but they don't think about it for their families. So the very first thing that you need to ask yourself is, what do you want for the vision for your family? Like, what does that look like? What does that feel like? In your mama heart, what are the things that you want to teach your beautiful babies before they leave the house, before they're out of the comfort and the hygge? That's a Danish word that means like cozy and comfortable. When they leave your house, what are the most important things are they going to need to know and believe and feel? Perhaps it's that you like, I want them to have a relationship with God. Maybe it's, I want them to be a great citizen. I want them to have a strong moral character and a strong moral compass. Perhaps you're like, you know what? I want them to be financially sound and financially literate. That's not taught in public schools very often anymore. I mean, some schools are thinking about it, but things like financial literacy are not taught. They're not. But by golly, calculus sure is. And I use that all the time. Let me just tell you, in my day-to-day, tongue in cheek, right? How do I find answers? Like, where do you find answers to things? How do you learn new things? How do you navigate through life? There's things on your mama heart that you want to impart to your kids, but I bet you haven't thought about much, right? I don't think a lot of parents think about those things until their kids are about to leave the house. I know for our oldest, that was something that I did think about. I was shortly before he left the house, I was like, shoot, did we teach him what we wanted him to learn, and what did we want him to learn? Right? And so I want the very first thing that you need to do is decide what your vision for your family is. Now, there is a corporate executive coach by the name of Cameron Harold, and he had helped 1-800-GOT-JUNK, be put on the map. He coaches chief operating officers, and he did a TED Talk, and I thought it was interesting, and he talks for business owners, right? For small business owners and for mid-sized business owners. But his TED Talk absolutely applies to your family. As a matter of fact, you should do it for your family first. His TED Talk, and I've included a link in the show notes for you so you can watch it. His TED Talk is called Your Vision Statement Sucks. And he talks about having a vivid vision for your company, right? But as you listen to the TED Talk, I want you to think about, what is my vivid vision for my family? And maybe it's something that you and your spouse sit down and discuss together so that you can create something really beautiful with your family. That's what you need to start with, is what is the vision for your family? And then you work backwards, right? You're beginning with the end in mind. You're deciding where you want to go before you ever get on the path to get there. I feel like too many of us we throw our kids in the system, and I did it, right? Without thinking, what's my end goal for these children? What's my vision in the long term, not just in the next 5 years or 1 year or whatever? Like, what's the long-term vision? That's one of the things that I thought about as I was hauling my kids to soccer and different things, is like, is this what am I trying to create professional soccer players? Like, is that what my goal? Wait, what? It's interesting, because as you start to create this vision for what you want for your family, you'll start to eliminate things, right? We talked about that last week with really saying no to a lot more and creating mental white space. Well, your vision becomes your guidepost to guide your path and get rid of the things that are not essential. Okay, so that's the very first thing that you need to do, is what does your family vision look like? And then work backwards. Then plan out the year, and then break the year down into months, and the months down into weeks, and the weeks down into days. And it doesn't have to be really specific, like, okay, we are going to be learning about plate tectonics and geography in October, and then in November, we're going to learn about this. It doesn't have to be that specific, right? It can be very vague and generalized, and you've got the flexibility to be able to change things how you need to. And my friends, I know that many of you are very worried about, but will my children be on grade level as I'm creating this vision and trying to teach them the things that I desperately want to teach them? What about grade level? Don't worry so much about grade level. I know you are. I know you're going to, right? I get that. Eventually you'll start to let it go a little bit. But worry about, what is the end goal for these babies of yours? You had them. Why? Why did you have them? What did you want to do with them to make the world a better place? And then start with that. So very first thing, the question you have to ask yourself is, what is the vision for our family? What is the vision for these children? What do I, in my mama heart, want them to learn first and next? And what are the most important things that they need to take with them throughout their lives, that when they are an old person, that they'll say, my mom always said XYZ. Like, for example, my mom always said, many hands make heavy burdens light. That stuck with me throughout my life. Even though I was public school, that's something that has always stuck with me throughout my life. My father would say, use it up, wear it out, make it do, or you do without. He came from parents who lived through the Great Depression. So what are those things that you want to instill in your babies before they leave your home? Because once they've left your home, you still have influence, but you don't have the same kind of influence anymore like you do right now. So that's the first thing you want to ask. This next thing that you want to do is discover what your children's passions are. Now, my friends, in the very first episode in the show notes, I posted a TED Talk by Sir Ken Robinson called Does School Kill Creativity? One of the things that I have observed about public school kids is they lose a vision for what they're good at, what they like, what they enjoy, and what they don't. They are so accustomed to being told what to do and when to do it that they start to lose themselves on this conveyor belt of education as they're being programmed to become what society expects them to be, not necessarily what or who they want to be. Do you know what they love? Have you ever had to fill out a paper that says, what do your children love? What do they love? And have you ever just drawn a blank and gone, I really don't know. I think they like video games. I mean, they like art. But like really drawn a blank of what do they like really? Like what do they really love? Well, soccer. Well, I mean, I put them in soccer. He likes soccer. She likes Bluey. Right? What happens is we also as parents stop seeing what they love, and they don't even know what they love. In a lot of cases, they'll draw blanks. If you ask your child today, like, what are some of the things you love? They'll be able to answer maybe a couple of things. And then I see it over and over again where they just get a blank stare and like, I don't really know what I love. And they have to think about it. They have to think about it hard. Last year, I was asked to teach a class to a group of 8 to 11-year-olds. And I was going to teach the same class 3 times in a row. And the class was on friendshipping. And so there was about anywhere between 15 and 30 kids in the class. It was for 1 hour, and then it was a summer camp, and then they were going to rotate and go to another class. And then they had 3 classes they were going to go to and then just do this fun activity. So I was asked to teach the class on friendshipping. So I read a couple stories to the kids and we talked about friendships, and I pulled on Brene Brown and the marble jar and everything. And then I said, okay, I want to go around the circle and I want to hear some of the things that you love to learn about. So tell me anything that you really get excited about learning about. And I was kind of dumbfounded because as we went in the circle, I started with the first child, and the first child drew a blank stare. And I gave him a couple minutes to think about it because it's always important to me. If I ask a question, I have to give time for processing that question. Whether it's adult students or young children, they have to have time to process the question. So I gave them a couple minutes to process, and I said, okay, let's go ahead and get started. Tell me, what's your name and what is something that you love? And I remember the first boy drew a blank and he's like, I like math. And I'm like, okay, great. Next child, what do you love? And the kid was like, I like lunch and recess. I'm like, all right, well, okay. And by the third child, I was like, what do you like? And he's like, I like recess too. And I said, oh, okay. And I stopped the kids. I'm like, no. We're going to stop. Let me rewind. When you're at home by yourselves and you can do anything, right? What are the things that you really, really enjoy doing a lot? Like you get super excited to think about that when you're at school and you're thinking about going home. What are the things that you think about that you love, that you really enjoy doing? And it was like this light bulb went on for half of the kids, and the other half of the kids looked even more concerned because they didn't know. And so some of the kids are like, I like video games. When I get home, I like to play video games after I do my homework, which, by the way, for a lot of kids is the only time during the day that they get control of something. They can go into these video game worlds and have complete control of their world where somebody else is not telling them what to do. Interesting thing about video games. You wonder why kids are addicted? That's one of the reasons. They get some out of controls. Now, of course, there are dopamine hits and all of that other stuff that happens in the brain. Yes, I'm not advocating for video games, but I am saying I understand why kids and teenagers become addicted to them, right? They get a little bit of control Don't necessarily agree with it, but I'm just saying, I get it. I understand. I understand what's going on in their brains. That the desire for control, right? So the kids kept going around. One kid's like, I like to play soccer. I'm on a team and I really like it. I'm like, awesome. What do you like? This girl, I really love gymnastics and I'm very good at gymnastics. Okay, awesome. What do you love? So one kid's, I really like to read. I like to read sci-fi books, and there's like 11-year-old kid, basic sci-fi books. But it was interesting because some of the kids didn't know what to say. As a matter of fact, I'd say most of them drew a blank on what they actually liked. And it was a very, very rude awakening for me. But yet I remember when I very first started homeschooling my own kids, they also didn't know what they liked, except for my now 16-year-old son, who has always said, I like business. I want to do business, but he's also always had a very strong personality. Whereas my other kids had to really think about it. My 11-year-old now definitely knows what he likes. He knows what he loves. So it's interesting with the founding fathers, by the time they were 12 and 13, they had some good idea of the profession that they'd be going into. They had some idea of what they really loved and enjoyed. But remember, how much did they actually go to school? Well, those that could afford it went to common schools, but even the common schools they didn't take a lot of time, and it certainly wasn't all year long. It was just for a few months, and then they were at home, right? Helping with the family stuff with all the other entrepreneurs, because we weren't quite into the Industrial Revolution in the United States just yet, and in some cases it wasn't actually in the colonies, because back when they were in the founding, it wasn't quite a full country just yet. So, but they knew by 13 years old, they were kind of considered adults. And so they also had the time to process and think about all these different trades. Benjamin Franklin's father said, Benjamin, what do you want to do? You could be an apprentice to your brother as a printer. You could do this. You could do this. Start to decide, start to think about it. And if you don't, I will point you in a direction and you will figure it out. Ultimately, Benjamin Franklin became one of the very first millionaires in the colonies and in the United States, right? So he also had time to really think about what he loved. Do your children have that kind of time to really think about, what do I love? What am I passionate about? Because they've got to know that. That becomes then the catalyst to drive their education. Yes, are they still going to learn to read and write and do basic math? Of course. Are they going to still learn some things about the sciences? Of course. But as you expose them to things and give them time to have mental space to think about what they enjoy and try different things, beauty happens. So as you create the vivid vision and then you really discover what the kids love, some magic happens, because that starts to inform what you choose to teach your children and how you choose to do it. By the way, and we'll talk about this in the future, curriculum is what is taught. Pedagogy is how you teach it, right? Two different things. And we really only have one pedagogy that is done in our education system, and it's that stand and deliver. The teacher dispenses the information to the children like they are pitchers waiting to have water poured into them. And that's kind of it. And I know that people are like, oh no, I do all these different things. No, it's pretty much the same. The teacher's the authority. The child does what the teacher says. They get a grade, the end, right? There are other pedagogies, my friends. There are different, and in my opinion, far superior pedagogies than that. But part of what your job as a parent is, as you're discovering what they love, is to help them where they are, because they will feel paralyzed at the beginning. It's scary when you first ask them, what do you like? What do you love? You're going to have to help guide them as parents and direct them. I had one of my listeners, and happens to also be a friend, said that she started to cry when I asked her that question. I said, what do your kids love? And she started to cry, and she's like, I don't know. Isn't that sad? I don't even know. I know their general kind of likes, but I started thinking about that because I asked her over a period of several days. Again, I want you to go back to, what do they like? What's your vision for your family? What do they like? What do you want to teach them? You know what you want to teach them, but what do they like? And she cried. She's like, I felt like I knew my kids and I don't. I don't really know them. That's one of the beauties of homeschooling, by the way, is you come to see your kids in a totally different light. And you become excited for the things that light them up like light bulbs. And it's beautiful to watch. Instead of watching their spirits go dim and die of... I see it happen all the time in the public schools, right? The kids come home, they start as kindergartners excited to learn, and by 5th grade, they hate school. They hate it. It sucked the life right out of them. It sucked the joy and the light right out of them. They think of learning as a chore as opposed to a beautiful thing, right? So she started to cry, I don't know. So she started asking her kids that question. She went through the whole, that initial paperwork that I gave her of really deschooling and what did you like about school? What did you not like about school? What are some things you want to learn about? So she did that with her daughter, and lo and behold, something surprised her about her daughter. And her daughter's like, well, I really like Tahitian dancing. And she's like, awesome. She was like, but Mom, I'm wondering if I don't like wearing the coconut bras. By the way, if you've ever seen, people often confuse Tahitian dancing with hula dancing, and they think the fast moving hips is hula dancing. That's not. That's called Tahitian dancing. It's from the island or the country of Tahiti, right? And so her daughter's a Tahitian dancer. And she said, Mom, I don't like wearing the coconut bras. And she said, well, is there a different costume that you could wear that's a traditional Tahitian costume? And there indeed are. And so she was able to sit down with her daughter and look it up online, and she helped her daughter. At the beginning, she was like, well, I told her to go look it up, and then she didn't. I said, well, she's going to feel paralyzed again because she's always been used to being told what to do and how to learn and all that. Why don't you sit down with her and then have her sketch out the costumes that she finds in her research, but you help her with the research, right? You're going to have to teach her how to learn on her own because she's so used to being told what to do by a teacher that she's going to be paralyzed at the beginning, even though she's 12, 13, right? You're going to have to help her, and then she'll gain independence. Don't worry, So really discover what they love. What are the things that matter to them? And that becomes part of that springboard of here's my vision for our family. Now here's your vision of yourself as a human being. And by the way, they have opinions. They have hearts and minds and thoughts. We can guide them, but ultimately it's theirs. All right. So then the next thing that you've got to do is become aware of how your child learns. It doesn't matter which curriculum you get. Most of the curriculums, well, they all vary, right? There's some that are open and go where you open it and it says you read this to the child and then they do this and you know, those are called open and go curriculums. A lot of curriculums are open and go. A lot of curriculums that are created are meant to be like you're doing school at home. And we're going to talk about this next week, the different philosophies in homeschooling. That's one of the philosophies is you are doing school at home. By the way, it's the least effective for most kids. So that you know, just throwing that out there, right? Although some kids do like it, it just depends on the child. The question you have to ask yourself, and you're going to have to start really observing as a mom, is how does my child learn? So I want to talk for just a minute about learning styles. Now, the traditional learning styles are visual. They learn through sight, auditory. They learn through hearing, tactile. They learn through touch. Kinesthetic, they learn through doing and moving, and reading and writing, which falls under also visual. But I want to talk about some other learning styles for you to just kind of think about. I got this from a timeforlearning.com website. They've got some great resources. They do have curriculums that tend to be a little bit more like traditional school at home, but online learning. And by the way, if you're going to an online school, like I hear this all the time, like, oh, COVID didn't work for me because the online didn't, I couldn't homeschool because they were online all day. And I'm like, actually, most homeschoolers would say that's not technically homeschooling. I mean, there are some online homeschools, but it's still like they're in a system, right? The true homeschooling parents, the purists will say, no, true homeschooling is guided by the parent and the child, not by necessarily online curriculum, which is not always effective. Okay. But I'm not going to go into that. If you choose to do that, that's your choice. And guess what? I'm not going to judge you mostly. Okay. So let's talk about these kinds of learning. We've got the visual spatial learners. Again, this comes from timeforlearning.com. I loved it. When I first read this, I'm like, yes. So I want to share this with you. The visual spatial learner. The visual learners are those who prefer learning by observing things. Using visual aids such as pictures, images, diagrams, whiteboards help these learners understand information better. They easily visualize information, have a good sense of direction, and usually like to draw and doodle. Okay, so that's the visual or the spatial learner. The oral or the auditory learner. Sound and music appeal to these learners who typically have a good sense of rhythm. These learners are usually singers or musicians who are familiar with different instruments and the sounds they make. Oral learners are good listeners who normally learn best through verbal presentations like lectures and speeches. Okay? So that's your oral or auditory learners. The verbal or the linguistic learners. These learners prefer using words both in speech and writing. They can easily express themselves and usually love to read and write. Verbal learners tend to have a vast vocabulary and excel in activities that involve speaking, debating, and journalism. Okay, I have a 7-year-old and she talks nonstop, but she also has an intensely good vocabulary. It's interesting because she's my child with sensory processing disorder, and when she was tested, we found that she had uneven development. It would confuse people because at the time she was 3, but she was emotionally a little bit younger when we first had her tested. But her vocabulary was unbelievable. So people would think she was older because she's tall, and she has this incredible vocabulary, but at the time she was emotionally a little bit behind. Eventually the gap came together, right? But she's a speaker and she'll verbally process things. We'll listen to an audiobook and a few days later she'll come back and discuss that with me, or I'll be do a read aloud with her and she'll come back and say, "Mom, do you remember this?" And she'll sit and talk me through her thought process, right? Very verbal or linguistic learner. Physical or kinesthetic learners, okay? My 11-year-old is a kinesthetic learner predominantly. Most people have a few, like they learn several different ways, like it's not just all or one. They're not one purist thing. But my 11-year-old's predominantly kinesthetic. He has to be moving, right? ADHD kids, he actually doesn't have ADHD. He tends to be a little bit more quiet, but he learns best through moving. ADHD kids oftentimes are these kinesthetic learners, but they're expected to be auditory learners. And so they struggle. The whole learning process is a struggle for them. So especially if your child has ADHD, look at like when they learn, are they moving? Are they perpetually like their body's in motion all the time? So let's talk about kinesthetic learners. Whether it's by using their bodies or hands, these learners are all about the sense of touch. Physical activities and sports play a big part in these students' lives. Getting hands-on is a must for these learners who love to tinker and learn best when they can do rather than see or hear. Okay, so if you tell a child who's a kinesthetic learner and you give them a whole bunch of instructions verbally, they might get one if you're lucky. Okay, they've got to learn and do at the same time. Okay, logical or the mathematical learners. If there is logic, reasoning, and numbers involved, these learners are sure to excel. These students function and solve complex problems by employing strategies and a scientific way of thinking. Computer programming, math, and science are usually favored by these types of learners. My father has one of these brains. When we would go on long road trips when I was a child, before the days of videos we'd have in the car, we just have our tapes, right? And when we all started falling asleep and he'd be driving these long distances on our road trips and my mom was asleep in the car and all the rest of us were asleep, I asked him one day, I'm like, "Dad, you just sit there. How are you able to stay awake?" And he said, "I do math problems in my head." I'm like, "Do you like that?" And he's like, "I love it. I get time to think and work through these beautiful math problems." And he loved it. Of course, he ended up going into computers. Okay. Next is the social or interpersonal learners. Learning in groups and working with others is favored by social learners. These students know how to communicate effectively and enjoy collaborating with others, brainstorming and discussing ideas and concepts. Social learners are generally good listeners who are thoughtful and understanding. So they love that. They learn through that dialogue with other people, okay? And then finally, the solitary or intrapersonal learners. These students prefer to use self-study and work alone. They are independent, very self-aware, and in tune with their thoughts and feelings. These learners prefer being away from the crowds and learn best in a quiet place where they can focus on the task at hand. Okay, so the interesting thing is people always say, oh, you are definitely an extrovert. And it's true. Like, I am a chatterbox. I do love to be very social. But in the workplace, I preferred working at home by myself. If I'm with other people, I can't get anything done, and it makes me crazy. Same with studying and learning when I was in college. I had to be alone. It would drive me nuts to go to study groups. I hated them, right? So even though I've got this big personality, I prefer learning by myself. I prefer looking stuff up alone. I tend to be a solitary learner, and I enjoy it that way, right? I don't like necessarily being in a class with a million other people. I like learning by myself, which is interesting because you'd think that I would be more of a social learner. Okay. So again, people have multiple learning styles. They're going to have a predominant learning style, but they're going to have all these others as well. Again, they're visual, spatial, oral, auditory, verbal, linguistic, physical or kinesthetic, logical, mathematical, social, interpersonal, solitary, intrapersonal. Okay, those are the major learning styles. Okay, you need to discover what learning styles your kids, how they learn best. I've heard, like, when I would go to teacher in-services and teacher development courses and everything, they talk to us about, and in-services, they talk to us, make sure that you hit all of the learning styles for your students. But the reality is, when you have 30 kids in your classroom as an elementary teacher, or you've got 30 kids in a classroom and multiply that by 5 or 6 classes a day, it's very difficult for those teachers to hit all of those learning styles. Now, once in a blue moon, you get these magical fairy teachers. We've all had them at least once, at least one of them, where they just are amazing teachers and they hit your learning style, but they may not be hitting another person's learning style. Or they try to employ all of the learning styles to hit all of the kids. But the reality is, most teachers teach the way that they teach, and then they hope that the kids fit in the box. And I think about this, especially like my daughter's pre-algebra teacher when she was in middle school. He would stand up, he would do on the board, or on the screen, the math problem, explain how it is, and say, now you go figure it out and try it yourself. And if you have questions, raise your hand. And if not, you're going to have to come in during lunch, right? Super boring. Oh, and by the way, half the time he used Khan Academy, which is a free website that homeschoolers use all the time for math, right? Or he'd use a YouTube video to show something, which, by the way, we can also do at home. So it was really hard for my daughter because that's not how she learns, but yet that's how he taught. And so when you look at the public school system, these teachers are not able to really embrace your child's learning styles. They're not. They've got too many students to worry about, and lives beyond the school to worry about, and 5 lesson plans a week to put together, and state testing and national testing that they have to worry about, and all these requirements of them, and state requirements of them. And so their main focus, and this is not dissing these teachers, like, right? I believe the teachers right now are underpaid and all the stuff, but they cannot focus on your child's learning style because they have too many other responsibilities and other children to worry about too. They do. But guess who can focus on your child's learning style? You. You know why? Because you're the parent, because you'll be with them. And you're not dealing with 30 kids. You might be dealing with 6. You might be dealing with 2. You might be dealing with a couple newborns if you have twins, but you're not dealing with 30 or in some cases 150 when it's middle school or high school. So you have the opportunity as a parent to really discover how your children learns or how your child learns. And isn't that beautiful? What a great thing. So as you start, before you decide what curriculum to use, you got to decide, start observing how your children learn things. Start by teaching little mini lessons of different things and see how your children learn. Observe them. Observe them as they watch YouTube. What do they do as they're trying to learn something on their own? How do they go about that? Observe that. My 11-year-old, he's now 11, but last year he really wanted to learn Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, third movement. I've mentioned this before. Okay. So he wasn't allowed to play video games at all that day. He was grounded from them. Okay. Sometimes I ground my kids from video games. When they get all their stuff done, oftentimes in the afternoon, I'm like, okay, yeah, you can play for an hour or so, whatever. But in this case, he did not do his chores and he was being a little bit of a pill that day, which is funny because he's a quiet kid. He's not a troublemaker by any stretch of the imagination, but he didn't do what he was supposed to. So I said, buddy, you can't play video games at all today. You have to figure out something else to do, right? I know you finished your other work, but you can't. Not this afternoon. You don't get screen time. So he said, well, can I use YouTube as a tool? And in the future, we're going to talk about using technology as tools for creativity versus entertainment and being a consumer. We'll talk about that in the future. But in this case, I said, you may use it as a tool for learning only. And so he said, okay. So before I know it, he takes the iPad and he puts it on where you put sheet music on the piano. And he turns on Moonlight Sonata on one of the tutorials on how to learn this movement. My friends, for 8 hours, 8 hours, he worked on one scale. And I watched him. Again, I think I've told this story before. I watched him stop, push play. He had to see it, he had to hear it, and then he had to do it. He had to do it. He had to do it again and again and again and again with his fingers. And he would practice again and he'd practice again. And I saw how he was learning, what was going on. Okay, he's partially visual. He's partially auditory. Okay, there's the kinesthetic, right? He had to have all of those things. And so it's fascinating. You'll start to see how your children learn best. And that helps you. And so as you get curriculums and decide, okay, I am going to use a curriculum or whatever, you can look at the curriculum and go, okay, oh, wow, this curriculum really hits their learning style. Or no, it doesn't. We're way off mark. This is probably not the best curriculum for this child to learn. Okay. So you've got to come to understand their learning style. So let's recap again really quickly. Have your vision of what you want for your family, what the things that you want to teach your children before they leave the house. You're going to find out what they love and what they're passionate about so that you can give them ample time to learn those things and to explore those passions. And then you're going to be observing how they learn so that you can tailor their learning to them, because they're the ones that have to do the learning, right? You're learning along with them, but you're going to be learning some different things. Now, the final thing I want to talk to you about is this notion of attention span. Now, it's interesting because some of the occupational therapist websites and therapy websites I've gone to says that you can tell how much time you spend on a subject with a child depends on their age, and you take their age and you multiply it by 2 to 3. So if they're 6, you multiply that by 2 to 3, so you get 12 to 18, and that's how many minutes you can work on a subject. However, there is a little bit of controversy there because according to the Student Coalition for Action and Literacy, they believe that the formula for attention is the child's age plus 1. So if the child is 6, you add 1 minute. I saw Julie Bogart of The Brave Writer posted this on Facebook this past week. And I'm like, yes, Julie, yes. Oh my gosh, you hit the nail right on the head, right? So the Student Coalition for Action Literacy says this. They say you take the child's age and then you add 1. That's how long you have on a subject before they're going to need a break. So if you have a 7-year-old, you take that 7-year-old, you add 1, they've got 8 minutes. So you've got bursts of learning as opposed to long lectures of learning. Think about in the school system right now, kids are expected to sit there for long periods of time with very few breaks, right? Very few recesses. And yet we know developmentally, children need time to play and to explore, and they need mental breaks. As adults, like if you've ever had to go to any sort of training for work, or if you've ever gone to a conference, I about die when the speakers go more than an hour. I'm 46. I've got 47 minutes of attention before I start to lose it. But we see this in the schools all the time, like where the teachers will go on and on and on. And after, a few minutes, the kids just are glazed over and they're done. Their attention span is finished. And so you've got to, if you are teaching specific set lessons, keep that in mind. It's got to be short bursts of learning, and then it's a break. They might get up and get something to eat. They might, do different things. Now, my 11-year-old, the one who learned Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, third movement, that whole long scale, I would watch him, and every few minutes he'd get up and get a drink, or every few minutes he'd get up and he'd stretch and he'd walk around, or he'd go outside for a few minutes and then come back. But he'd always come back to it. We know that when a person goes into a state of flow, when they're really enjoying what they're learning, and they're self-directed in their learning, they go into what's called a state of flow, which companies want employees to go into that state of flow. It's the state of the highest amount of creativity, right? When they really enjoy the subject. There will be times that your children will be enjoying something so much that they won't want to take a break, and that's okay. That's totally okay. They'll take a break when they need it. So if they do go into, you see that they're going into a state of flow, let them be in that state of flow. Okay, let them be in that flow state. But most of the time, they're not necessarily going to be in a state of flow if you're doing a curriculum with them. And so you've got to do short bursts of lessons. Okay, you've got an 8-year-old, you've got 9 minutes. You've got a 16-year-old, you've got 17 minutes. You've got a 47-year-old, you got 48 minutes, okay? Before they're going to need a mental break and have a brain break to reset. Interesting thing is, if you look it up, it talks, educators, make sure you give brain breaks for the kids. I think some do, but most don't. They're like, I've got 45 minutes. I've got state standards. We're just going to plow through it. We're going to plow through it, right? Because your kids aren't in school, you get to really work with them properly and developmentally and give them the brain breaks that they need. Okay? So make sure that you meet your kids where they are. Make sure that you are aware of their attention spans and what you've got with them. Make sure that, really quick, one other thing is, you might like a really strict schedule, but you have a child that's very unstructured and prefers an unstructured rhythm. Again, you've got to meet your child where they're at. Or perhaps you're really an unstructured mom, but you've got a couple kids who love a lot of structure. Make sure that as you're creating your rhythm for your family, that you meet them where they're at. That might mean that you might have to adjust something for a couple kids differently than how you would do it, or how you might do it for a couple other kids. I've got 2 children that they like to have the checklist of everything that they want to get done for that day. They like that checklist, right? And then 2 other children who are these free thinkers and who like a lot of unstructure. And so we have guidelines of things that they want to get done. And you'll watch them throughout the day. They'll have their lists of things that they need to get done. And my list people are like, I'm doing this for this long, this for this long, this for this long, this for this long. And then my other kids are like, first I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to go outside and play. And then I feel like I want to do this, right? And so you've got to meet those kids where they're at. All right, my friends. I'm excited. Next week, we're going to be talking about pedagogies, philosophies, curriculums, what all of that actually looks like. But for this week, I want you to really focus on what's your vision for your family? What are the interests of your children? What are their learning styles? And it might take you a little while to discover those things. And then how can I create little bursts of learning for these beautiful children who you love more than anybody else in the world? I am super excited for you, my friends. You've got this. I know you're still scared. I know you're still nervous. I know there's a lot to think about, but you've still got this. Even your worst